what he expected. And Abel followed it to the letter. Abel followed it carefully, and Cain didn't. I mean, that's the conclusion we can draw. 1 John 3, verse 11 and 12. I don't know that we read this last time. I'm going to read it this time. 1 John 3, 11 and 12. For this is the message which you have heard from the beginning, that we should love one another, not as Cain, who was of the evil one and slew his brother. For what reason did he slay him? Because his deeds were evil and his brothers were righteous. Well, what deeds of Cain were evil? That there is something apparently in Cain bringing his offering to God, the way he did it, that was evil, that would be considered evil. Now, we don't know exactly what the nature of the evil is. We can speculate a long time on what that might have been. That evil may have been in his attitude. It may have been in the way he offered. Perhaps he was being very insulting to God in the way he offered it. We don't know. But the fact is that, as John here, describes it in 1 John 3, where we just read, that it was described as evil. There was an unholiness and an unrighteousness about it. But we also notice that the author of this text, I believe it's Moses, we pointed that out. The author of this text, though, in these passages of Genesis 4, 1 through 8, two times emphasizes these two men are brothers. He says there in verse 8, even in that one verse, chapter 4 and verse 8, Cain told Abel his brother. There's an emphasis there that this is his brother. And it came about that when they were in the field, Cain rose up against Abel, his brother, and slew him. And that repetition there is suggestive of the idea that this was an important point. The Hebrew writers tended to repeat points that were important, and the fact that he repeated the fact that this was his brother serves as emphasis on the nature of the crime. It's one thing to have one man be angry with another, but here are two men who are brothers, who ought to be close. They ought to be very close to one another. They ought to be very caring for one another, very concerned about one another's welfare, and yet one rises up against the other and kills him. And it does point to the degeneracy that we see here from Cain, that he would do such a thing. Yeah.
Last week we talked about skins.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. That's the suggestion, yeah, is that these might have been sacrificial animals. That is a possibility that maybe some instruction had been given to Adam and Eve were in turn to pass on that instruction to their sons. And so in that sense, God gives the instructions to Adam and Eve give the instruction to their sons of this need for an ongoing sacrifice. That's a possibility. These fellows need not have heard that directly from God. They could have been instructed, as you point out, by their parents as to what God was expecting from them. So that's a good point, Bill. All right. We go on then with one of the most, this is one of the most perhaps insulting is not the right word. This is one of the most callous statements in the Bible. We go on from here. Verse 9, then the Lord said to Cain, where is Abel your brother? And he said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? Again, this has been called one of the most callous statements in the Bible. Did Cain know where his brother was? Oh, yes. Cain knew exactly where his brother was. So we find here that he is lying. He lies directly to God. Adam and Eve, when they committed their sin, we remember when they committed their sin, they at least admitted they had sinned. They tried to blame somebody else for the cause of it, but they at least admitted it. God said, did you eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil? They at least answered truthfully. Yes, I ate, but it wasn't my fault. It was somebody else's fault. Here's God asking Cain a direct question. Where's your brother? He says, I don't know. An out and out lie, a direct lie, and showing how far he has gone into the degeneracy caused by sin, that now he is willing to basically look God or address God and speak a lie in his mouth. He says, I don't know, I'm my brother's keeper. He says, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you cultivate the ground, it shall no longer yield its strength to you. You shall be a vagrant and a wanderer on the earth. And Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is too great to bear. Behold, thou hast driven me this day from the face of the ground, and from thy face I shall be hidden, and I shall be a vagrant and a wanderer on the earth, and it will come about that whoever finds me will kill me. And the Lord said to him, Therefore whoever kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord appointed a sign for Cain, lest anyone finding him should slay him. We can compare this. Let's look at this passage in Hebrews 12 that I've noted up here, Hebrews 12. And starting in verse 22, says, you have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to myriads of angels, to the general assembly and church of the firstborn, which are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of righteous men made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood, which speaks better than the blood of Abel. And so we find here this passage in Hebrews referencing this event. It references Abel's blood crying up from the ground, says the passage in Genesis, and yet we are told in Hebrews that here is the blood of Jesus, which speaks a better thing. We're gonna examine that here in just a minute or two and see what it is that we have here, where God, the blood of Jesus speaks a better thing than the blood of Abel. We find, however, in this passage, Cain now is cursed. The ground will no longer yield up him, become a nomad. And there is some suggestion from ancient texts, not just in the Bible, but from other cultures, the ancient texts, that in sort of the societal pecking order, if you will, in the society of that time of those ancient civilizations, you had the royalty, of course, was at the top, and then below that you might have had the priests or some of the other religious figures, and then you had the folks that lived in cities, and then you had folks that lived in villages, and sort of the lowest order, the lowest kind of pecking order, the lowest social order in these societies were the nomads. That this was considered a curse from God in these societies, it was far better to be a city dweller or even a village dweller than to be a nomad, rootless and wandering around. And so here is Cain wailing about notice his attitude. It's, oh, woe is me. Look what you've done to me. There's no remorse over the murder of his brother. There's no repentance that we find here at all over the murder of his brother. It's all about me, me, me. We find that in Cain, and we understand that echo. We've seen it in our own culture and in people around us who when they're finally caught doing something wrong and they're to be punished for it, this is just way too severe. This is just way too much to have to tolerate. We can't invoke any kind of penalty on these folks because that's just way too severe. And it's just all about woe is me with some folks rather than any kind of acknowledgement that he has of the crime that he's committed. There is some suggestion in the writings here and in God's instructions to him. He says here, the ground will no longer yield up its strength to you. He says you will be, you will be a vagrant and a wanderer on the earth. Well, essentially, there are only two occupations about this time. You can either, there are really two ways to get food. You either grow it there, or you are raising animals. And so there is the sense that Cain now has to become essentially a herdsman. That is a possibility that he became something of a herdsman, in which case God's punishment for him is you now get to take on the job your brother was doing. And so that is an interesting thought too, that God has decided that since you have put to death this one who was taking care of these animals, now that becomes your job. Yeah. Yes. I think yes. I think there's a real arrogance that we see there. Yeah. You see it. Yeah. Yeah, Rita's pointing out, here we see in Cain's attitude a real indifference toward God. We see we see a man here who does not care about God or about the commands of God, and we find here a man who is arrogant toward God. And I think that's an excellent point that Rita's making about that. Here's a man arrogant toward God. And we find that, as she points out, propagating through his lineage here. We're going to see his lineage in the rest of this chapter and find out that, they just go, it essentially goes from bad to worse. And we see that a lot of that in religion today. Yes, that's correct. Yeah. Well, we see a lot of folks that are willing to make, some obligatory move or some lip service. Even Jesus, we recall, condemned those who were honoring him with his lips, but their heart was far from God. Honored God with their lips, but their heart was far from him. And he condemned them. And I think this is what we maybe have from Cain. Cain was willing to honor God with his lips, in a grudging way, but his heart wasn't there. Yeah.
We look at this and think about
Yes.
Yet it's no different what we see around us.
I know.
I remember the Menendez brothers 20 years ago.
Yes.
I was getting over 20 years ago. At their trial, they complained, they killed their parents. So they complained, we're orphans now.
Yeah.
Thinking to myself,
It almost sounds like a bad joke.
It
does sound like a bad joke. Yeah.
And it brought the nation to watch that trial in some detail because it was so outrageous. Yet we look at what goes on, it doesn't seem that outrageous anymore. We see a lot of stuff going on. Of course, one of the differences in the news cycle, we get our news so fresh and 24/7, all that kind of good stuff. But we see this stuff, and there's no difference. And that's the point. There's no difference between what's going on today and what we found in the Bible.
Yes.
Certainly, Cain was judged for his behavior, and we're going to be judged for those that are doing something things that not yet.
I know. I agree. Yes. Yeah. We see that the generosity of, as it says here, who's going to kill him? Well, who's the folks that try to suggest there was only Adam and Eve, and Cain's afraid to kill me. Even Cain and Abel. Now there's only Adam and Eve and Cain. The only one that would find him would be mother or father. And are they going to kill him? And their suggestion here, then, the obvious suggestion here is that at this, than just 3 people in the earth, a civilization, if you will, and so the idea that there was somehow there had to be some additional creation or some additional miraculous bringing forth of human beings to give Cain his wife, for example. No, the text does not support that. Indeed, the text supports just the opposite. I want to go back, though, and consider this idea of the blood of Abel speaking from the ground. And we find out what did the blood of Abel say? We know that the blood of Abel says in Hebrews 11 and verse 4, when we read about Abel, we read that by faith, we find that by faith he offered his sacrifice. And the text in Hebrew to say that he obtained the testimony that he was righteous. And so here is of Abel that speaks that he was a righteous man. He was trying to do it from the heart, apparently, that was Romans 12 and verse 19. Take your own vengeance, beloved, but leave room. Vengeance is mine, I will repay. So that here was who was murdered, who had no one to for him, and yet God took vengeance for him. You want to know how God will repay? Well, look at the example of Cain and Abel. There was God who had discovered the crime and who had made his judgment, made his pronouncement upon Cain. We get into as we remember that passage, we find that God put a mark upon Cain so that everyone who found him would know who he is, and that they would not kill him. Some have asked, well, what is the mark of Cain? And there's all sorts of speculation, all kinds of speculation about what the mark of Cain. I was going to put John on the spot, but I think he's gone to pick up his mother. And the fact is, we don't know what the mark of Cain is. Some have suggested it was some kind of a tattoo. Some have suggested that because of the characteristics of the wording that's used, that it was perhaps some sort of paralysis or a partial paralysis that he suffered as a result, and therefore that was the mark of Cain. Some of the Hebrew writers even suggest or Jewish writers suggest that he had a horn growing out of the top of his head as a sign, and so it becomes very speculative and very questionable about what the structure was all about. But we don't know the mark of Cain. Some have even suggested that God changed the color of his skin, which I think is completely speculative and completely nonsensical. There's nothing in the Bible to indicate that. All we do know is that God said, first of all, God made it clear we're not going to kill this man, and he's going to have to basically live with the knowledge of his crime. He has to live with the knowledge of his crime, and he has to now live, like I suggested before, doing the work that his brother had been doing. Yeah, it's an obvious mark of some kind. It was an obvious characteristic of some kind, though, that anybody who met Cain would know immediately that's who he is. That's right. Yeah. It may not have been. We just don't know why. Some suggest even a tattoo of some sort. We don't know. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, it is. Yeah. I've heard that same kind of an idea, and again, some of the speculation when you read about, for example, in Acts, there with the death of Stephen, if you remember the events of the death of Stephen, and when he is being murdered by that mob, and he announces that he sees Jesus standing at the right hand of God, and what is there significance to the fact that Jesus is standing rather than sitting? And some have suggested that may be indicative that this was an especial outrage to Jesus, and therefore he is standing in his outrage rather than remaining seated. But it's an interesting question. To go on with that too. We read Matthew 23, verses 34. Starting in verse 34, he says, therefore, behold, I am sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, that upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. truly I say to you, all these things shall come upon these generations. And you've got to, you think about that, that example, Rita. Jesus here warning these Jews, all of this righteous blood is going to fall upon you. And we, of course, know what happened to the Jewish nation shortly after this time, that they were besieged by the Romans, of course, with the destruction of Jerusalem. But even prior to that, if you read, the account of Josephus about the events even leading up to that time, you find this absolute anarchy that comes upon the Jewish nation, where they are as busy killing each other as they are killing the Romans. That they are very anxious to launch attacks at one another, and anyone who doesn't agree are going to be killed. They had Josephus talks about these roving gangs of Jews who would go through the marketplace and stab to death anyone that had been targeted, murdering them in open daylight, broad daylight, with apparently no fear of retribution. So you talk about, yes, I think you got a point, Rita, that when God considers those who are murdering the innocents, murdering the righteous, that there is an extra measure of punishment handed out, perhaps even in this life, for some of those, that they are that God will see to it that they are crushed, and I think that's what we see happening as Jesus describes here in Matthew 23. We go on then in some of these passages. Again, I want to point out some other things the blood of the blood of Abel says. John 3, 1 John 3, verses 10 to 13 contains the idea, do not marvel, brethren, if the world hates you. The world will hate believers without cause. John warns us of that, tells us that God is going to, or that the world is going to hate us. Here we had Cain, who hated his brother Abel without cause. There was no reason for Cain to hate Abel. Abel didn't do anything to Cain other than make him look bad, or at least try to show him a better way. But instead of Cain recognizing that and trying to adopt the behavior of his brother Abel, no, Cain decides, no, I'll kill him instead. We find that the blood of Abel cries out for true worship, and that true worship has got to be from the heart. As some have already pointed out, even in the class today, here was Abel who offered his sacrifice to God with a good heart. Here was Cain who offered his sacrifice perhaps only with lip service, but he did offer a sacrifice, but it was perhaps done with resentment. And therefore, it does make a difference how we worship God. John 4, if we turn over to the book of John, read that passage. Then we note here, John 4, verses 23 and 24. An hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers shall worship the Father in spirit and truth. For such people that the Father speaks to be his worshipers. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. And this is clear from the example all the way back to Genesis. Those who are going to worship God have to worship him in spirit and in truth. And Abel did so, and Cain did not. We continue on with the passage in Hebrews. Again, we are pointed out that by faith, Abel had offered the sacrifice to God, and in Hebrews 11 and verse 6, just 2 verses later, it says, without faith, it is impossible to please him. And so it is absolutely required to obtain God's approval in our worship. We have to be doing what we're doing in faith. And again, we remember from Romans, faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. And finally, we would go with, again, a passage ought to be familiar to us out of the book of Romans. Romans, the first chapter, in verses 18 or 16 and 17, rather. For I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed. From faith to faith, as is written, but the righteous man shall live by faith. This is the message, was really the very message that Abel is trying to present. This need to be offering to God those things that and to do it in faith and to be obedient. And so this is the message that this is what the blood of Abel cries out. We go on then with the rest of this chapter. And this is now following, we're going to follow, this is sort of the lineage of Cain that we're going to follow here. And we're going to see what happens to the rest. Then Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. And so this is some area east where the garden had been located. And Nod here is slated as a land of wandering. This is the definition of the word. It says, and Cain had relations with his wife, gave birth to Enoch, and he built a city and called the name of the city Enoch after the name of his son. Irad became the and Mehujael became the father of Mehushiel, and Mehushiel became the father of Lamech. And so we begin to see this genealogy then of Cain as his sons and grandsons and so forth are born. Jewish tradition holds that this family continued their nomadic lifestyle. They became essentially we would call them a clan of raiders, attacking and stealing from others. That they were, that's how they sort of kept themselves going, was by raiding in on the folks. We're growing the crops and we're building the cities. Verse 19, and Lamech took for himself 2 wives. The name of the first one was Ada, and the name of the other Zillah. And Ada gave birth to Jabal, and he was the father of those who dwelt in tents and have livestock. And his brother's name was Jubal, and he was the father of all those who play the lyre and the pipe. As for Zillah, she gave birth to Tubal-Cain, and the forger of all implements of bronze and iron, and the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. And Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, listen to my voice. You wives of Lamech, give heed to my speech. For I have killed a man for wounding me, and a boy for striking me. If Cain is avenged 7-fold, then Lamech 77-fold. Here is this example that we have. First of all, we find out that Lamech becomes the first bigamist that recorded in the Bible, the first man with multiple wives. We can see here that breakdown of the marriage relationship that God had established, Adam and Eve. We remember what God had said, for this cause will a man leave his father and mother and will cling to his wife. And there is no indication there of multiple wives of any kind. That is a complete invention of man. And so here we find this breakdown of the culture of society. There is some observation here. If we consider this, this is a degradation of the role of women in society. This reduces a woman to nothing more than a producer of children. She is no longer a helpmeet fit to help man. She is. This reduces the role of a woman to simply that role of producing children. And you have multiple wives. Why? Because you want a lot of offspring, and you don't care about a relationship and a helper to help you through life and through the decisions of life. All you're interested in is, let's make as many progeny as I can. And so this is a very it reduces the role of women, the role of the woman, in a very graphic way, in a very callous way, to that of simply being a vessel to produce children and nothing more. And so we see here is Lamech, who begins this behavior. If you look through the texts of the Old Testament, we would find, we'll find men who were married to more than one woman at a time. But what we would typically find in those relationships is that relationship ends up causing those characters a lot of problems, a lot of trouble. You think about the various ones that are named that had multiple wives, and that situation ends up creating a lot of problems in the family. Obviously the most notable one would have been Jacob and his wives, who were then in constant, even though they were sisters, in constant conflict with one another. And then we find here's Lamech. I think I misread that. I thought it was tenfold. No, he says, I'll repay 77-fold. He'll repay not 7 times, but 77 times, according to this text. And what does that suggest? Well, I think Rita was going there with her comments earlier, that there's an arrogance to this. There's an arrogance that says, yes, God would repay 7 times, but I'll repay 77 times. It's almost as if Lamech is making himself more important to God and 11 times more important than God, if you will. He's really becoming boastful, and we find that boastful attitude again throughout the text of the Bible. We find that boastful attitude becomes an affront to God. I think it's a different Enoch. I think so. Because Enoch over in the next chapter, chapter 5, is the son of Jared. And here, this Enoch is the son of the son of Cain. And so I think it's 2 different guys with the same name. Okay? As if to counter this, then, the author now concludes this chapter by bringing out the lineage of Seth. And so it says, verse 25, and Adam had relations with his wife again, and she gave birth to a son and named him Seth, for she said, God has appointed me another offspring in place of Abel, for Cain killed him. And to Seth, to him was also a son born, and he called his name Enosh. And men began to call upon the name of the Lord. And so here we have, from the contrast of Cain's lineage, and we see the degradation, the moral decline of Cain's line, and yet by contrast now we're going to be following this line of Seth and his family line, where we see a spiritual, a righteous line. It is Seth's line, of course, that will produce the Messiah. This is, again, Seth is another seed. That is the meaning of what she says here. In Eve says here, she says, God has appointed me another offspring. Well, that offspring is another seed. And again, she is showing her faith in God's promise. We also find out from this that Adam and Eve are both very aware that Cain killed Abel. We don't know how they found out. We don't know if God told them. We don't know if Cain told them. We don't know who told them, but they are very clear that, they obviously know that Cain killed Abel. We see here at the end of this, though, that in contrast to Cain's line, here is Seth's line, and it says, as we read here, men begin to call upon the name of the Lord, and the idea here is that the people of God begin to worship God. They begin to, there is that now sort of a split in society between those who are going to worship God and those who will refuse to worship God. All right, we'll continue on. We'll get into chapter 5 next week. I appreciate your attention this morning. Thank you.